Hello, and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk About Shh. Let's Talk About Shh is a podcast aimed to help you navigate your relationships, maximize your pleasure, and get the most out of your sex life. Each episode, we cover different topics related to the full spectrum of sexuality, romance, love, gender, equality, consent, you name it. My name is Tila. I'm a sex educator, relationship expert, and published author. People often ask me why I love doing this podcast, why I love talking about sex ed and teaching sex ed, and it's because it is my favorite topic. I love to read it, write it, talk it, teach it. I love helping people navigate difficult conversations and understand their own sexuality and to foster healthier and better relationships. So if you're struggling with an area around sexuality and relationships and you have a question that you want answered, please send in your questions to questions@exploresextalk.com. This episode, we are going to talk about not all men. This is an episode I've been meaning to write for quite some time. It's never easy to talk about complicated issues, particularly ones that are emotionally charged. People are coming to discussions of these issues with all kinds of backgrounds and personal experiences. And as humans, our perceptions are really influenced by our most personal experiences because it's what we've known and seen for ourselves. In discussions about equality, it's an important thing to remember that each person will experience a similar situation differently. Not only because of how they may choose to respond, but also how other people in the situation choose to respond to an individual. A person's gender, ethnicity, age, appearance, or any number of other factors can have a huge impact on how someone else approaches us in a situation, and many of these elements are out of our control. It is in this simple way that gender equality continues to thrive and survive. So it's a really crucial thing to remember when listening to the voice of others. Just because you experience something one way does not mean that another person didn't receive an entirely different treatment in the same situation. That being established, let's dive in to the sticky mess that is not all men. When we're looking at arguments and objections like not all men, not all white people, not all whatever, the first thing we need to remember is whatever triggered this not all reaction was a general statement or argument. By definition, a generalized statement is a broad statement or an idea that is applied to a group of people or things. And often generalizations are not entirely true because there are usually examples of individuals or situations where the generalization does not apply, the exception to the rule. Everything has this. Most things in our world fall on a spectrum where various individuals will fall anywhere in the range of that spectrum. When someone makes a generalized statement, no one ever means every single individual with no exceptions ever. So if someone makes a statement like, all men are jerks, or, something much more colorful that I'm sure you or I have read online somewhere, it's pretty much a guarantee that very few people actually mean every single man on this planet. It's a generalized statement, and it should be treated as such. So if it's a general statement, what makes it so offensive that people need to jump in and make the distinction? Well, we all want to be thought of as nice. We all want to be thought of as good people. Very few people think of themselves as a bad person or aspire to be a bad person. Even bad people tend to rationalize away their nefarious actions to justify why they did those things. It's pretty common for people to immediately jump to the defense of something that threatens their sense of character. People want their goodness to be validated, and they want it to be validated in the eyes of others. We don't want anybody else thinking that we're a bad person. So in many cases, this is what drives that need or that impulse to speak up with, oh wait, but not all men, white people, whatever. Now, I've come across some people who argue that this doesn't need to be a problem at all because people could just acknowledge exceptions by deliberately saying it's a general statement. Say something like, most men are jerks instead of guys are jerks. So why isn't that more of a thing? Well, in many cases, it's because general statements don't need qualifiers. Most people grasp the concept of a general statement. And it's because when general statements are made about men, it's usually because it comes from a woman who is angry, because women have been hurt, and because there are many problems on a societal level that still contribute heavily to the normalization of violence against women. It's also a fact that when statements are softened, many men just tend to ignore them. It becomes well, that's not my problem because I'm not like that. And that person said, most men, and I'm not most men, so therefore it's not my problem. And all of a sudden, the statement gets no reaction, it gets no attention, there's no support given, it doesn't do anything to combat the actual problem because in the mind of the man, it's not their problem. But the reality is that violence against women, things like sexism, gender inequality, all of that are a man's problem because men are literally the only people who can solve it. It is the responsibility of those with more power to do what they can to create spaces of equality and lift up the voices of marginalized groups. And let me tell you, no voice is ever lifted up. No one is ever lifted up by telling them that they're wrong, that they need to repackage their message to be more appealing, or that someone would only listen to them if it wasn't so offensive to the ears. Taken from the wisdom of Spider-Man and all those other comics and practically every hero story ever. But to paraphrase Spider-Man, or actually not really paraphrase, to quote Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. When the issue of not all is forced, it says to everybody involved in that discussion that the person forcing it cares more about their own ego or sense of self-esteem than they do about the bigger issue or the pain of the person or group making the original statement. Many of these statements are voiced out of anger, frustration, pain, they're made to raise an awareness of what is the reality for many women. Some are deliberately worded this way to voice those intense feelings. People are angry. They have the right to be angry. They have the right to express their anger. Sometimes it's deliberately stated that way to shake off indifference of so many men, to get past that reaction of, oh, well, that doesn't apply to me. So when someone takes the not all argument, it actually comes across as extremely dismissive to the problem because it does nothing to address the problem. And the only thing it does do, the only thing it can accomplish is validate the ego of the person who's saying not all. One of the other main issues here is that our system is currently built on a patriarchy that is very oppressive. And it's been highly oppressive in the past, and it continues to be oppressive in many ways for all the leaps and bounds we've taken forward. If it wasn't, then our society would look very different than the way it does right now. I know there's going to be some objections to this idea, and I can, almost hear people through the internet listening to this podcast being like, no, that's not right. But we're going to bypass that today because this is a discussion about not all men and not oppressive patriarchy, which is a much larger topic, and I'm not going to try and address both in this episode, so we're going to talk about that in a different episode. But the reality that many women face because of this oppressive patriarchy is that any man, good or not, has the potential to be violent because violence in men is heavily normalized. So heavily normalized that it is a common expectation or stereotype that men are brutes, men are dogs, men are aggressive and terrible, and that is the way men are. And bad and abusive behavior is glorified in so many areas of our society. We see this so easily when we look at things like locker room talk. We look at forms of media like music, TV shows, movies, even the way certain news headlines are phrased glorifies or validates violence in men. And all of these mediums show or encourage the idea that men are apparently only real men when they're extremely aggressive, prone to temper and violence, and dominating and possessive of women. When men are featured this way, it really sets the bar low for what counts as a quote unquote good man. In this light, to be a good man, all you need to do is simply be respectful and supportive in the most basic way. Fulfill the most basic requirement of being a member of a social group. Don't be an asshole. Great, that's what it takes to be a good man, apparently, by this definition of what the media shows. It's so much a part of our society that so many men fall into this trap and still contribute to the same things that perpetuate this image of men. And it's this image that is the cause of violence and abuse of women. Now, many men, they're not throwing punches, they're not violating consent or abusing women, but things like laughing at sexist jokes, indulging in locker room talk, absorbing media that glorifies violent men, and all the while remaining silent on the issue and the realities of the abuse of women. And all of this just feeds into that system of violence and oppression. So saying not all men is not enough, because very few men do actually much of anything to really contribute to the end of the problem. I mean, how many men can be counted who actively do all they can to taking a stance against violence and moving us towards equality? So what can men do? For all those men listening who want things to be different, who want the tides to turn, what can you do? For starters, stop arguing with women and bringing up not all men. Understand that while this is true, it isn't all men, it's not helpful. And regardless of your intention, regardless of whatever you mean by it, by saying not all men, it's basically telling the women around you that you don't care about what they face and you're not going to be an ally. You just want your pat on the head, be told you're a nice guy, and be sent on your way. That is what it is saying. So instead, start by listening. When someone is angry, one of the most powerful and amazing things one human being can do for another that is going to help calm them down is to listen with compassion and empathy. Help them understand that they feel heard. This does not mean that you need to blindly support anything said to the end of time or that you have to abandon all your beliefs and experiences. It simply means that you're open to hearing about the experience of someone else and understand that it's different from your own, and that you're capable of extending empathy and compassion. It can be really hard to hear some of this stuff sometimes, especially if someone is caught in the throes of anger and talking about past trauma. It can be really difficult to hear someone say things that could apply to you in some way because you're simply the same gender. It's important to remember to swallow your pride. This is not about you. Someone's trauma has nothing to do with you personally, unless you were the one who caused it or is compounding that trauma. So keep that in mind. When someone is talking, check your ego at the door and don't take it personally. Many men have been socialized to be problem fixers. A common complaint among heterosexual couples is that women feel that their male partners simply try to solve their problems instead of providing a supportive and friendly ear. People do not always want to be fixed or have their solution provided to them. Sometimes people just need that place to vent, talk through, work through all the emotions turning up inside of them. As a man, you can make a huge difference by pushing your own personal growth and developing those skills. Learn to be a supportive and attentive listener. Let people talk without pushing your opinion. Another thing you have the power as a man to do is to tell other men when to shut the fuck up. The reality is that the men who are really a problem or contribute to the problem the most are usually those who are extremely unlikely to be the ones to listen to women at all on this matter. It is here that men have the most power. No one is asking you to risk your own safety. You don't have to run into the streets and tell random strangers that how they talk about women or how they're treating that woman is inappropriate. I mean, depending on the situation, you may save someone's life, but you still have the power to choose what level of safety for yourself, and that's important. You have to choose where you're going to draw the line and take a stand. But the reality is that even doing that, there are plenty of things that men can do to exert influence and voice disagreement while remaining perfectly safe. Now, some men argue that they don't know any men like that. All the men they know are great and upstanding men who always stick up for women. But think about this. How do you or the men in your life talk about women when no women are around? Have you or your buddies ever engaged in locker room talk? Maybe teased each other about sexual conquests or a lack thereof? Did you watch The 40-Year-Old Virgin and laugh your ass off at all the jokes? Have you or your buddies ever catcalled a woman? Talked about being wingmen or developed a strategy or system for picking up chicks? How are women treated in your favorite TV shows or movies? What kind of lyrics about women are sung in your favorite type of music? The dynamic between a group of men and how they talk about women is more than just guy talk. It's not a rite of passage, and it's not just being one of the guys, to talk about or treat women like objects. It's an attitude. And it's an attitude that validates and continues to feed that system of inequality. Even if those same guys go home and treat their female partners fantastic, there are men who do not. And even if there's just one guy in the group who jokes around and demeans women with his buddies and then goes home to a woman he treats in the same way because now his buddies have validated all of his beliefs that men should dominate and possess women, and that's how he should act. And if he's not acting that way, then he's not a man. Domestic abuse is a huge problem. Huge. And it's not a stranger in the bushes, and it's not some random guy. It's not some unknown, faceless man. These people exist, for sure, but they are at the extremes. They are the extremes of the spectrum. The majority of abusers start small, and they've had their beliefs reinforced and validated by this, constant messaging everywhere. And if a man cannot voice disagreement or displeasure in front of his own friends for stuff like this, they ultimately are giving their silent approval. The silence is saying it's okay to continue to talk about and treat women like objects, and that women don't deserve more, and they don't deserve more respect. And if a man is too afraid to voice an opinion in front of people he considers to be friends, how good of friends are they? Now, I know some people are like, well, it's just guy talk. We're not really serious. But so the only way you can feel validated by your buddies is to put down other human beings. That is how you're defining your manhood. Think about that. So, my dear, not all men. The reality is that if you want more people to make this distinction, the power really rests with you. You are the only one who can impact change. You can help women feel more supported and heard so they know beyond a shadow of a doubt that it's not all men. And you can learn to improve your skills and become better allies and learn how to create more safe spaces for equality to grow. And ultimately, you have the power to challenge stereotypes and change and influence minds of those who would never stop to listen to a woman saying the exact same thing. So, not all men. You say, it's not all men. I say, it's not enough to say it. Show it. Thanks so much for everybody who tuned in for this episode. Please do not forget to send in any questions or comments you may have to questions@exploresextalk.com. I love hearing from you guys. The feedback has been great so far, and anybody who's not happy with what I'm saying, hey, don't be shy, send it in. I love dialogue. Dialogue is great. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, please hit that subscribe button, like it, share it, recommend it to someone. I look forward to seeing you next time for another fantastic episode of Let's Talk About Shh. And of course, as always, in the meantime, please stay safe and stay sexy.